The cameras flashed as Zariah stepped onto the red carpet, only to be stopped cold by the billionaire host's voice. "We don't let charity cases walk through the front door." Her gold-embossed invitation trembled in her hand while white-gloved guards blocked her path. Guests watched in silence, some smirking, others filming. But across the street, an old man in a long coat whispered, "She doesn't even know who she really is yet." And what happened next changed everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Snow drifted down in slow, deliberate flakes, the kind that made Atlanta's rare winter nights feel staged, almost cinematic. Outside the Lexington Hotel, heat lamps glowed like artificial suns, casting warm halos over clusters of well-dressed guests who laughed easily, their breath fogging the air as valet attendants hurried back and forth. A string quartet played somewhere near the entrance, the music muffled by coats of fur, wool, and designer scarves. This was not just a Christmas gala, it was a statement event, the kind where money and power dressed up as generosity for one night a year. Cameras flashed, names were checked, doors opened smoothly, everything worked the way it was supposed to, until it didn't. The black SUV stopped at the curb with a soft hiss of brakes. For a brief second, no one noticed it. Then the door opened, and Zariah Monroe stepped out. She was 17, tall and poised in a way that didn't come from confidence alone, but from long years of learning how to take up space without apologizing for it. Her gown was deep red, not loud but deliberate, the kind of color chosen carefully, as if she understood exactly what it would look like against the white snow in the gold-lit entrance behind her. She paused, steadying herself, the cold biting through her thin heels, her gloved hand smoothing the fabric at her side. The change in the air was immediate. Conversations thinned, then broke. Heads turned not with admiration but with calculation. Eyes lingered a second too long. Whispers didn't rush, they crept. Zariah felt it before she fully saw it, the warmth of the moment draining, like someone had quietly turned off the heat lamps just for her. She took a step forward anyway, lifting her chin, reminding herself that she had been invited, that she belonged here as much as anyone else stepping onto that carpet. A security guard shifted his stance near the velvet rope. Another glanced down at his clipboard, then back up at her, his brows knitting together. Zariah kept walking, every step echoing louder in her ears than the string quartet ever could. She reached into her clutch, feeling the edge of the printed invitation, crisp and official, her name spelled correctly, embossed in gold. It was a small thing, but it grounded her. Before she could reach the entrance, a man stepped into her path. He moved with the ease of someone used to being obeyed without asking. Charles Kingsley didn't need an introduction to announce his authority. It clung to him in the tailored cut of his coat, the expensive watch peeking from his sleeve, the way the staff subtly straightened when he appeared. He was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that stopped short of warmth, practiced and sharp around the edges. He looked her up and down, not quickly, not discreetly. His gaze was slow, appraising, as if she were an object that had ended up in the wrong room. The smile widened just enough to feel condescending. "Are you sure you're at the right place?" he asked, his voice calm, almost polite, carrying just far enough for the nearest guest to hear. The words landed heavier than any shouted insult could have. They wrapped themselves around her chest, tight and deliberate. Zariah blinked once, steadying her breath. She had imagined nerves, maybe even indifference, but not this public questioning of her right to exist in the space she stood in. She met his eyes, refusing to look away. "Yes," she said evenly, her voice quieter than his but steady. "I'm here for the gala." Charles let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head, as if amused by a child's misunderstanding. "This event is private," he replied, glancing briefly at the line behind her, where guests shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to stare. "Invitation only." Zariah reached into her clutch and pulled out the envelope, holding it between them. The gold lettering caught the light. "I have an invitation." She expected him to take it, to scan it, to realize his mistake. Instead, he didn't move. His eyes flicked to the envelope and away just as quickly, as if even acknowledging it might legitimize her presence. The silence stretched. Somewhere behind them, laughter erupted. Too loud, too forced. Charles sighed, the sound exaggerated, and gestured subtly to the security guards. "We can't just let anyone walk in off the street," he said, his tone shifting from amused to firm, "especially on a night like this." The word anyone hung in the air, loaded and unmistakable. Soraya felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment, but from anger she'd learned to keep carefully contained. She could feel eyes on her back, could sense phones being lifted, frames being adjusted. This wasn't private anymore. This was a performance, and she was being cast in a role she never auditioned for. I was invited, she repeated, more firmly now. My name is on that list. Charles finally looked directly at her again, his expression flattening. What's your name? He asked. Zariah Monroe. The name meant nothing to him, and that was the problem. His brows furrowed, not in recognition but irritation. I don't recall approving that, he said, turning slightly toward the nearest guard. Check the list again. The guard hesitated, then nodded, flipping pages with unnecessary slowness. Soraya stood there, the cold seeping up from the ground, her heels sinking slightly into the carpet. She could feel her heart pounding, each beat a reminder that she was still standing, still refusing to shrink. Around her, the gala continued as if this moment were just another form of entertainment, an unscheduled spectacle to break the monotony of privilege. Charles leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough to feel invasive. You know, he said quietly, sometimes people misunderstand email. These things get forwarded. Mistakes happen. Zariah understood the implication immediately. He wasn't just questioning her invitation. He was accusing her of theft, of deception, of trying to sneak into a world that wasn't meant for her. She thought of the careful way she had prepared for tonight, the way she had reread the invitation, checked the address, arrived early. She thought of how badly she had wanted this to go smoothly, how she had told herself that maybe, just maybe, things would be different this time. I didn't misunderstand anything, she said, her voice tightening despite her effort to keep it calm. I was invited, directly. Charles straightened, his patience clearly thinning. I'm not going to argue with you out here, he said, loud enough now for more people to hear. But I can't allow you inside without proper verification. She held the invitation out again, her arm beginning to ache from the tension. Then verify it. He didn't take it. Instead, he waved his hand dismissively. We'll handle it later, he said. For now, I think it's best if you step aside. Step aside. The phrase felt final, like a door closing. Zariah looked past him at the entrance, watching another couple glide inside without so much as a pause. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the knowledge that whatever she did next would follow her far beyond this red carpet. She tightened her grip on the invitation, refusing to move. Snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, settling on her hair and shoulders. Cameras were definitely out now. Someone whispered her name, mispronounced it. Charles's jaw tightened as he realized she wasn't going to disappear quietly. Zariah met his gaze one last time, her eyes steady, unflinching. In her hand, the RSVP remained untouched, undeniable proof of her place there. Proof that he still refused to acknowledge. And as the security guards took a step closer, the question hung unresolved in the freezing air. What would happen next? When she refused to step aside. The invitation trembled slightly in Zariah's gloved hand, not from cold, but from a cocktail of rage and humiliation brewing just beneath the surface. Her back was straight, her jaw clenched tight, but the ache in her chest was swelling. Just feet away stood the grand entrance of the Lexington Hotel, those gold-framed revolving doors spinning in steady rhythm, ushering in a parade of elites. Zariah remained where she stood, isolated like an unwelcome statue in the middle of a moving current. Charles Kingsley didn't need to say another word. His presence alone was enough. Around him, two security guards, in spotless white gloves, moved forward in silent unison, flanking him like armor. They didn't touch Zariah, didn't speak, but their formation said it all. This wasn't just security protocol. This was enforcement of an unspoken law. A human wall had risen, reinforced by uniforms and inherited arrogance, drawing a sharp line between them and her. Guests continued to drift past her, their faces carefully neutral. Some looked away out of guilt. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. One woman gave her a glance of smug pity before linking arms with her husband and gliding past. Zariah caught snippets of their voices, shallow laughter, muffled whispers, subtle mockery masquerading as discomfort. Her skin prickled under the weight of their judgment, though not a single one of them had said her name. Charles remained still, his hands folded calmly in front of him. But there was something chilling in his stillness, a calculated message that her defiance was beneath his time. When the next set of guests arrived, he broke formation to greet them with a glowing smile, even leaning in to kiss one woman on the cheek. Then he stepped back, effectively turning his back on Zariah, as if she were a valet who had parked in the wrong spot. The security guards remained. One of them adjusted his white glove slowly, pulling at the fingers until they snapped tight. Zariah noticed the gesture, small, but charged with meaning. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, and yet the world around her had shifted entirely. The glittering hotel lights behind her now looked like stars she'd never touch. She took in the scene, not just how it looked, but how it felt. The discomfort, the orchestrated exclusion, the way her presence was treated as a disruption. She clutched the invitation tighter. The embossed gold letters spelling her name, her rightful place here, meant nothing to these people. It didn't matter that she had received it through the proper channels. It didn't matter that she had spent weeks planning her arrival. To them, she was simply out of place, unworthy of the space her body occupied. A few feet away, a photographer broke the silence in an unexpected way. She was young, wearing an oversized coat with a worn press badge clipped to her camera strap. She wasn't with the official press line. She moved independently, almost like she wasn't supposed to be there. Her lens turned to Zariah, and without a word she started snapping photos, not of the gala entrance, or the socialites, but of her, Zariah, standing in stillness, surrounded by luxury. She wasn't allowed to enter. The camera clicked with mechanical consistency. Then, just as quickly, the photographer disappeared into the crowd, her presence like a ghost that had come to witness the injustice and capture it forever. Charles noticed the photographer. He looked over his shoulder, scowling slightly, then muttered something to his assistant, a young man in a navy coat with an earpiece. Zariah couldn't hear the words, but the way they both glanced at her afterward made her skin crawl. She was now more than a nuisance. She was a threat to the carefully curated image of the evening. One of the security guards finally spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "Miss, we're going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Zariah didn't flinch. She slowly slipped the invitation back into her clutch. She wasn't giving up. She was archiving. Every second of this moment was being recorded. If not by phone, then by memory. The air felt electric, and she realized, deep in her gut, that something bigger was happening here. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. This humiliation wasn't hers to carry. It belonged to the people enforcing it. She turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked away from the velvet rope. No tears, no apology. She walked not with the crushed posture of the defeated, but with the measured pace of someone who understood she had just been made into a symbol. A reminder. She was no longer simply Zariah Monroe, in a red gown. She was the girl they tried to erase, in full view of their own cameras. Just as she reached the curb, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her clutch, and the screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. No words, just a screenshot of an email. The subject line, Gala access, sender Charles Kingsley. Timestamped 3 days ago. The body of the email read, "We need to make sure the crowd looks clean tonight. Keep the door tight. No surprises. No Monroe." Zariah's breath caught in her throat. The chill in her bones wasn't from the weather anymore. Across the street, standing beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, was a man in a charcoal gray fedora. Older, sharply dressed but understated. He didn't move. He watched her, not with pity, but with purpose. Their eyes met. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, then began crossing the street toward her. Zariah didn't flinch as the man in the fedora approached. The streetlights glowed dim behind him, shadows folding into the creases of his coat. He stopped just a few feet from her, his eyes narrowing slightly, not out of suspicion, but recognition. He looked at her as if he'd seen this scene before. Not here, not tonight, but across decades. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the gravel of age, of patience sharpened by time. "You're Marilyn Monroe's daughter, aren't you?" Zariah blinked, startled not by the question, but by the name. Her breath caught again. "I am," she said softly, her voice more confession than introduction. He nodded slowly, not out of surprise but affirmation.
"Thought so. You got his spine."
He used to walk into courtrooms the same way you walked off that carpet, like he already knew history was watching. The name hung heavy in the winter air. Marilyn Monroe. To some, a civil rights relic. To others, a hero. To Zariah, he had simply been dad. Adoptive, yes, but never distant. He had raised her not with bubble-wrapped hope, but with blunt truths and unshakable love. He had taught her what it meant to speak when silence was demanded, to stand when the world said sit. He had taught her that her presence, her blackness, her brilliance, Her voice would always be seen as disruption in rooms not built for her. And now she had been locked out of one of those rooms. Literally, the man didn't offer a name, just a knowing look before slipping a small card into her hand. "People are watching," he said. "Keep walking like they are." Then he disappeared into the cold, swallowed by the foot traffic of a city already shifting its gaze. Zariah stood still for another breath before finally starting toward the subway. Her feet ached. Her gown clung to her calves, but she didn't let the cold see her shake. That night she barely spoke. Her foster mother, Tanisha, met her at the door with wide eyes, already half informed by texts from church friends and neighbors who'd heard something had gone down at the Lexington. Zariah handed her the phone, showing her the screenshot of the email. Kingsley's own words, proof that the rejection had been premeditated. Tanisha read it in silence, her lips pressed into a line. She didn't say what Zariah feared she would. "We should have known." She didn't need to. Instead, Tanisha pulled her in, held her longer than usual, and simply said, "We keep receipts. Let God handle the rest." But God wasn't the only one watching. By morning, her phone had exploded. Group chats, mentions, DMs, a text from a girl in her science class, simply read, "You're all over Twitter." Someone had filmed it. From the crowd, from the sidewalk, maybe more than one person. The video wasn't edited, wasn't explained, just raw footage of Zariah standing in her red gown, holding her invitation, while the white-gloved wall stood before her. And then Charles's voice, calm, smug, unmistakably clear. "Are you sure you're at the right place?" It was a slap, immortalized. The video had been posted late the night before with the caption, "This black girl was turned away from the Christmas gala," with an invite in hand. "You tell me what this looks like." By dawn it had been reposted by a dozen activist accounts, and within hours by celebrities, influencers, and legal analysts. Hashtags flooded timelines. "Let her in. Zariah Monroe Kingsley exposed." The internet, usually chaotic in its rage, found singular clarity in this story. Because it wasn't just about Zariah. It was about every red carpet, every classroom, every job interview, every boardroom, every unspoken no wrapped in fake politeness. By 9 a.m., a news van was idling outside Zariah's small home in South Atlanta. The logo read, YTL 5 News. The anchor, a polished woman with stiff curls and a practiced smile, stood beside the vehicle, speaking into her mic while gesturing toward the porch. Zariah watched from behind the blinds, her stomach tightening. Tanisha came into the room, her eyes narrowing. "Did they ask to come here?" Zariah shook her head. No one did. Outside, the reporter finished her segment and turned to the camera crew. Within minutes, her phone buzzed again. The station wanted a statement. Then another journalist messaged her Instagram. "Would you consider an interview to set the record straight?" Set what straight? She hadn't lied. She hadn't trespassed. She hadn't raised her voice, or thrown a scene. She had simply shown up with an invitation, and been told to disappear. And yet, there it was. The need to explain, to respond, to participate in her own defense against a crime she didn't commit. Tanisha sat across from her, gently taking the phone from her hands. "We're not playing defense, baby," she said firmly. "We didn't ask for a fight, but that don't mean we're not equipped for one." That night, they sat together at the dining table. Not with plates of food, but with laptops and documents. They printed the invitation, pulled up the email, backed up the text message with the screenshot. Tanisha called a contact, a retired attorney who had worked with Marilyn Monroe on several cases. Within hours, she looped in a legal team, just in case. But even as the grown-ups moved with caution and calculation, Zariah sat in the eye of it all, quiet but burning. It wasn't just about her anymore. Her name was trending. Her face was being dissected. People had begun pulling up photos of her with Marlon at legal fundraisers, trying to piece together who she was. Then came the twist. A clip resurfaced. Years old. It showed Marilyn Monroe, in court, defending Kingsley's company, during a heated racial discrimination trial. Zariah was barely 10 in the footage, sitting behind him in the gallery, legs swinging under the bench. The irony was painful. Her father had once protected the very man who had now tried to erase her. Headlines picked it up. Daughter of attorney who once defended Kingsley now rejected by same empire. The story mutated. It gained new weight. It became a legacy betrayed. The betrayal wasn't just Charles turning her away. It was the system using her father's credibility, when it was convenient, only to cast his daughter out when her presence didn't serve their narrative. That night, As the sun set and reporters continued camping outside, Zariah sat at her window staring at her own reflection. She remembered how, as a child, she used to sit in her father's home office, flipping through his legal briefs, highlighting random paragraphs just to feel important. He used to say, "Your name will matter, Zariah. Maybe not to the world, but to the right people it will." And yet last night, her name hadn't mattered at all. Or had it? Because now, as her phone buzzed again, a new notification popped up. Statement from Charles Kingsley, expected at noon tomorrow. And behind the van, a sleek black car pulled up. The passenger door opened. Out stepped a woman in a tailored gray suit, holding a tablet. She didn't look like press. She looked like she had come with questions, or power. The atmosphere inside Zariah's home felt heavier with each hour that passed, like the oxygen had thickened, charged with anticipation and disbelief. She sat motionless on the couch, still in her robe, scrolling through the flood of notifications that vibrated non-stop in her lap. What had started as a moment of quiet humiliation on a hotel sidewalk had become a national conversation overnight. Her name was everywhere, not whispered behind backs, but shouted across timelines. Let Her In had ignited across every major platform. The video of her rejection was being reposted by accounts with millions of followers. Some slowed it down, isolating Charles's words. "Are you sure you're at the right place?" Others stitched commentary, pointing out how calm she remained under pressure, how visibly uncomfortable the white guests looked as they passed her by. The elegance in her silence had become a symbol of resistance. Zariah's foster mother, Tanisha, moved through the house with anxious purpose, trying to protect her from the weight of the storm brewing outside their front door. But there was no escaping it now. What had happened on that red carpet wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a cultural rupture. When pop star Lula Raines reposted the clip with the caption, "You're not crazy, they do this, they've always done this, but not anymore," it was like someone had lit a match to a dry forest. Celebrities, influencers, former classmates, everyone had something to say. Some were inspired, others were enraged, and then there were the predictable few who labeled it a setup, a stunt, a desperate grab for attention. But even they couldn't escape the truth burning through the footage. Zariah had come with proof, and she had been denied with precision. When Charles Kingsley's office issued a formal statement, it only added gasoline to the fire. With sterile language and veiled blame, the message framed Zariah as a potential security threat, questioning the authenticity of her invitation and hinting that she may have forged her way in. Due to recent security threats leading up to our annual gala, the statement read, "Our team exercised precautionary judgment. Ms. Monroe's name was not confirmed on our guest list, and the invitation she presented is currently under investigation." It was cowardice disguised as professionalism. It was also a lie. Zariah's hands trembled as she read the statement aloud. Tanisha, reading over her shoulder, let out a slow, tight breath. "He's calling you a liar. In front of the whole damn world," she said. Zariah nodded, but what churned in her wasn't just anger. It was betrayal, not just from Charles, but from a system that would so easily paint her as a threat for simply showing up. Her presence had challenged something too sacred for them to name: comfort. And for that she had to be erased. But what Charles didn't expect, what he couldn't control, was the internet's collective memory. Within hours, screenshots of Zariah's invitation surfaced. Someone had photographed it the night of the gala. The gold lettering, the RSVP code, everything matched the event's official format. Legal analysts began weighing in, confirming the document's legitimacy. Soon, past stories about Kingsley's exclusive events resurfaced. Photos from previous years showed a sea of white faces. Whispers from former employees gained traction. This wasn't a fluke. It was a pattern. Then came the break Charles never saw coming. An anonymous Twitter account posted what appeared to be an internal email from Kingsley's company. The subject line, "Gala Aesthetic." The message, sent 5 days before the event, read, "Image is everything. Keep the aesthetic tight, polished, clean, camera ready. No walk-ins, no charity cases, no distractions. I don't care who she thinks her father was. If her name's not on the master VIP list, she's out." The internet exploded. Within minutes, the hashtag Kingsley emails was born. But it didn't stop there. The same account posted another screenshot, a confirmation from Kingsley's executive assistant, that read, "Zariah Monroe, RSVP confirmed via Gala CRM. Invite sent." It was damning. Not only had Zariah been invited, She had been confirmed. Her name had been in the system. The rejection was not an accident. It was deliberate. The lie was unraveling in real time. Zariah stared at the screen, frozen. Her skin buzzed. The quiet humiliation of being turned away had already scorched her. But this was something else. A calculated erasure. A system that had known exactly who she was, and still treated her like she didn't belong. She wasn't anonymous. She wasn't an unknown. She was the daughter of Marilyn Monroe, and Charles had used that knowledge against her. Tamisha placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Your father once told me Kingsley was slick. Dangerous but slick. He said, that man will smile in your face while drawing the line at your feet. Zariah looked down at her phone, her heart pounding. The world was watching. The lies were unraveling. And then, another twist. Late that night, a direct message appeared from an anonymous Instagram account with no profile picture and no posts. The message read, check your father's files. Folder marked, Night Ridge. He kept receipts. Zariah's breath hitched. Night Ridge. She had heard the name once before. Years ago during a late-night conversation her father had with a colleague. She hadn't understood it then, but the tone in his voice had made her remember. She tore through the storage closet, pulling out one of the old file boxes from Marlon's legal archives. Her hands moved fast, searching. Then she saw it. A thick folder labeled in black marker. Night Ridge. Inside were printouts, contracts, memos, documents that connected Charles Kingsley's company to a private consulting firm, once used to suppress employee complaints and bury internal scandals. At the back of the folder, stapled to a faded printout, was a post-it note in her father's handwriting. He'll bury your name one day. Keep this. Zariah sank to the floor. Her fingers clutched the edges of the pages, and for a moment she just breathed. Her father had seen this coming. Not the gala, not the cameras, but the intent, the erasure. He had left her the tools. Now it was up to her to use them. As she sat in the hallway, lit only by the blue glow of her phone, a new message notification lit up the screen. It was from Charles Kingsley's verified Instagram account. One sentence. Let's talk. Privately. Zariah hadn't replied to Charles's message. She didn't need to. By the time she lifted her head from her father's old files, the internet had already done what no private conversation could undo. It turned the quiet rot beneath Charles Kingsley's reputation into a wildfire. And then it got worse, or better depending on who was watching. Just past midnight, a new tweet surfaced from the same anonymous account that had leaked the email confirmations. This time the content wasn't corporate or legal, it was personal. A single screenshot of a direct message Charles had sent to a private group of high-level event staff. The message was plain and cutting. We can't have the event looking like a shelter tonight. There was no ambiguity. No way to spin it. He hadn't said her name, but the context was undeniable. She was the only one turned away. She was the one who didn't fit the image. The internet didn't wait for explanations. It detonated. The backlash was immediate and merciless. High-profile sponsors, banks, beauty brands, hotel partners, began releasing carefully worded statements announcing they were reevaluating their association with the Kingsley Foundation. Celebrities who once posed for pictures at his charity events now tweeted in disgust. Even news anchors abandoned neutrality. On-air analysts debated not whether his actions were racist, but how such behavior had been normalized for so long. At the center of it all was Zariah, still in her small house, still in pajamas, watching her world crack open under a microscope she never asked for. Her face had become the face of exclusion, of elitism, dressed in tuxedos. But she wasn't celebrating, not when the internet that rallied behind her was the same one threatening to define her life by a single moment of rejection. Tamisha hovered in the kitchen, watching the news crawl across the bottom of the television screen. Kingsley Gala under fire after racist message leaked. The anchor's voice was grave, but the fire behind her eyes was unmistakable. Zariah turned to her foster mother, 1,000 emotions pulsing under her skin. Why is it that the more they expose him, she said slowly, the more exposed I feel? Tamisha walked over and cupped her cheek gently. Because baby, the truth might be about him, but the consequences still land on you. It was true. Even as sponsors pulled away from Charles, the media couldn't resist pulling Zariah deeper into the center of the spectacle. Old photos of her with Marilyn Monroe were republished. Classmates she hadn't spoken to in years were interviewed. Online detectives dug through her social media, reposting pictures of her school projects, debate wins, even childhood dance recitals. Everything about her life was being reframed through a new lens. The girl they rejected. Then Charles reappeared, 2 days after the message leak. He stood behind a polished podium in a navy blue suit, flanked by his legal team. The press conference was broadcast live. His face, once casually charming, now looked gaunt, strained by days of public pressure. But what shocked viewers wasn't just the fact that he refused to apologize. It was how he chose to attack. With faux sincerity, he began. We are living in an era where optics are often twisted before facts are verified. What occurred at the gala was not racially motivated, but a response to a valid security concern. He then shifted. I have recently learned more about Ms. Monroe's past. While I respect the legacy of her late father, it's important to understand the full picture. Ms. Monroe has no biological ties to Marilyn Monroe. Her name, while respected, may have been used to leverage access to high-profile events. Zariah's mouth fell open as she watched the screen. The room blurred. Tanisha's voice cut through the silence. Oh, he's reaching now. That man's cornered. But Zariah couldn't look away. The implication was chilling. Charles was now trying to discredit her not by denying his actions, but by unraveling her identity. As if being adopted made her less legitimate. As if Marlon's love, protection, and teachings could be dismissed because she didn't carry his blood. He's not just erasing what happened at the gala, she whispered. He's erasing my right to the name that made him who he is. Social media erupted again, this time with more fury. Adoption advocates stepped forward. Black leaders denounced Charles's comments as classist and dehumanizing. A viral tweet read, "This man used her father's name to shield his company for years, and now he wants to disown her. He can't erase what that name means." But the damage wasn't just emotional, it was psychological. Zariah stayed off her phone the rest of the day. She didn't need to scroll to know what was out there. It was all too loud. By evening, a producer from a national morning show called Tanisha directly. The offer was tempting. A prime-time slot. Zariah would get the chance to speak her truth on live TV. They offered car service, wardrobe, hotel, Zariah sat across the room, listening silently, as Tanisha took the call on speaker. When the producer finally paused, her tone softened. There's just one thing, she added. Given the sensitivity of the situation, our team would prefer Zariah wear something professional, neutral, and if possible, we'd like to avoid directly calling Charles racist. We want to focus on her journey, not the controversy. Tanisha's face went still. She looked at Zariah. Zariah didn't speak. She just stood up, walked to her room, and shut the door.
They didn't want her voice. They wanted her trauma.
They didn't want the truth. They wanted a redemption arc for ratings. As she sat at her desk staring at her reflection in the mirror, Zariah realized this wasn't just about a gala anymore. It was about how the world packages pain, how it edits black girls into digestible stories, so long as they don't make too much noise. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a different number. Unknown caller. No ID. When she answered, the voice on the other end was quiet but urgent. I'm the assistant. I leaked the emails. There's more. He's been deleting files since the press conference. Meet me tomorrow. There's something you need to see. Zariah hadn't slept the night the assistant called. Her mind kept looping the words, he's deleting files. But before she could even plan the next step, the media machine knocked again, this time with a glossy smile, and a folder stamped with the red and white logo of WNN, one of the largest national news networks in the country. The woman who stood at their front door introduced herself as a senior field producer. She carried herself like someone who could command a room with a whisper. Her offer was simple but powerful. A one-on-one primetime interview. Zariah's voice, she said, deserved a national audience. Her story could reshape the conversation. But just before leaving, the producer casually added a final note. We'd prefer she wear something soft-toned and professional. And if possible, steer away from any strong racial messaging. Viewers respond better to stories of growth than conflict. Zariah didn't react outwardly, but inside, something recoiled. Tanisha, however, didn't hide her response. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she repeated the phrase, strong racial messaging? The producer smiled, too rehearsed to flinch. We want to focus on Zariah's strength, not division. People are looking for hope right now. Zariah nodded politely, but she already knew they didn't want her truth. They wanted her trauma packaged as palatable, cleaned up, edited down, and softened for comfort. Still, she agreed to do it. Not because she trusted them, but because letting others control the narrative was worse. 2 days later, she was sitting under the bright lights of a WNN studio, flanked by cameras, makeup artists, and a small army of handlers. Her natural curls were flattened into a tight bun. The outfit picked for her was pale blue, collar buttoned to the top. She looked more like a lawyer than a teenager. Camille Harrow, the anchor chosen for the segment, was elegant and composed, known for human stories and a voice that could calm firestorms. She opened the interview with soft empathy, leaning forward, nodding at all the right moments. At first it felt genuine. Zariah spoke carefully but clearly about her father, the red carpet, the systemic wound that ran deeper than any single night. She explained how quiet exclusion was more violent than loud hatred, how being invisible was more damaging than being yelled at. But midway through, the temperature shifted. Camille interrupted her mid-sentence, tilting her head sympathetically. But wouldn't you say this was a misunderstanding? A moment made bigger because of the internet? Zariah blinked. No, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was calculated. Camille smiled. Of course. But we want to focus on your resilience. That's what inspires viewers. The producers were watching from behind the glass. Zariah could feel it. She adjusted her posture. She recalibrated. This wasn't a safe space. This was a curated stage. So she gave what she could. Still herself, but now conscious of every word that might be cut. When the camera stopped, Camille leaned over and hugged her, whispering, "You're brave. You really are." Zariah left the studio with her jaw tight, and her heart heavy. Something felt off. The air in the room hadn't matched the energy of the interview. There had been a subtle edit before the edit. 2 nights later the interview aired, but it wasn't hers. Not really. The broadcast version was sliced to ribbons. Her quotes about systemic racism were gone. Her statements about deliberate exclusion were rearranged to sound vague, uncertain. A clip of her smiling nervously was placed after a comment Camille made about miscommunications. Her voice was softened until it barely existed. Camille's closing line, spoken over a slow-motion shot of Zariah walking through the studio hallway, was sometimes the strongest messages are found in silence. Zariah watched in stunned silence as her face filled the screen. Familiar, but empty. Her words had been weaponized into compliance. She didn't even recognize the version of herself they presented. Tanisha, sitting beside her, turned off the TV and didn't speak for a full minute. When she did, her voice was low. "They just used you to launder his image." Zariah didn't respond. The silence in her chest was louder than any insult. But the next twist came fast. An anonymous email arrived late that night. No subject, no signature, just a Dropbox link, and a note, "Studio vault footage. You deserve to see what they cut." Zariah opened the link slowly, her hand trembling. The file was raw, a full studio reel, unedited, showing everything from multiple angles. She watched it in real time, the questions they had deleted, the moments Camille's eyes narrowed during direct answers, the full weight of what she'd actually said. Then came the most chilling part. Backstage audio captured after the shoot. Camille, laughing with a producer, said, "She almost made it too real. Good thing we cleaned it up. No need to get the suburbs riled up." The producer laughed back. "Yeah, can't scare off the donor." Zariah froze the frame. The betrayal settled into her spine like ice. They hadn't just diluted her message. They had mocked it. They knew exactly what they were doing. Tanisha read the transcript over her shoulder and whispered, "You gave them truth. They turned it into decor." And then her phone buzzed again. A new text from the assistant who had called before. It was short but urgent. "He's panicking. Charles is deleting everything. I have one last file. You need to see it. Meet me. Come alone." Zariah stood alone on the sidewalk downtown, the winter wind curling around her as the city pulsed quietly behind her. Her breath came in soft clouds, visible under the dim street lamps, each exhale tinged with nerves. The assistant had told her to come alone. Against Tanisha's better judgment, and her own. She did. She didn't know who would show, or what exactly she was risking. But something inside her said this wasn't about interviews or optics anymore. It was about truth, the kind people tried to bury. A shadow peeled away from a nearby alley. A figure in a hoodie, head down, moved swiftly toward her. No name, no greeting, just a flash drive, slipped into her hand with quiet urgency. "Open it tonight. He's wiping servers. What's on there might be your last shot." The figure vanished before she could respond, swallowed by the dark. Back home, Zariah plugged the drive into her laptop, hands shaking. Inside, she found the full uncut footage of her WNN interview. Multiple camera angles, studio audio, raw, She hit play, and for the first time she watched herself without edits. What stared back at her wasn't the hesitant girl they had aired. It was her steady, passionate, unflinching. She spoke of exclusion not as theory, but as lived reality. Her voice didn't tremble from fear. It trembled from knowing. The lines they had cut came roaring back. Systemic racism doesn't need to shout to be deadly. And they didn't just block me from a party. They tried to write me out of a world my father helped build. Then came the part she hadn't seen. Footage from backstage. Camille Harrow, laughing with a producer, saying, "No need to get the suburbs riled up." The producer replied, amused, "She almost made it too real. Good thing we cleaned it up." That was it. Proof that her erasure wasn't accidental. It was strategy. Without hesitation, Zariah uploaded the full video to her own page with a single caption, "This is the version they didn't want you to see." Within hours, it exploded. 2 million views by dawn. Celebrities reshared it. Activists quoted it. Student groups played it in classrooms and cafeterias. College dorms held impromptu screenings. Teachers projected it on school walls and asked students, "What do you hear in her voice?" The answers were unanimous. Truth, power, clarity. For the first time since the Gala, Zariah wasn't being spoken about. She was being heard. Her own words, unfiltered, did what a dozen edited soundbites could never do. They lit a fire. Outside Kingsley Corp's headquarters, protesters began gathering, first in dozens, then in hundreds, and by the weekend, thousands. The chants rang like thunder through glass towers. "Let her in. She belongs. You can't delete us." Zariah stood on the outskirts one evening, hood up, unnoticed among the crowd. Her hands gripped the edges of her father's old notebook. She watched strangers shout for her, hold signs with her name, demand justice on her behalf. She hadn't asked for this movement, but it was moving now, and it carried her name. News outlets shifted quickly, sensing the change in public tide. ONE scrambled to respond, releasing a vague apology blaming internal miscommunication. Camille Harrow vanished from the airwaves. But the public was no longer interested in spin. They had seen it, not just the injustice, but the attempted erasure. The entire system had been caught doing what so many had suspected for years, rewriting the truth to protect power. Still, Charles Kingsley said nothing. That silence cracked when a new encrypted email arrived in Zariah's inbox. The sender called themselves Ghost Inside. No name, no hint of identity, just documents. 7 PDFs marked confidential. Inside were spreadsheets and memos from inside Kingsley's company. One document listed guest names for the gala, each labeled with appearance impact. Some were tagged polished, others brand safe. Next to her name, "Doesn't match image." Another memo instructed staff to ensure guests reflect aspirational tone. No exception. Diversity wasn't representation. It was choreography. Zariah sat at the kitchen table. The pages spread before her like war plans. Her heart beat fast, not from fear, from clarity. These weren't just receipts. They were blueprints of discrimination dressed in corporate language. Tanisha walked in quietly and took it all in with a glance. "You ready for this?" she asked. Zariah didn't hesitate. More than ever. But just as she began gathering the documents into a folder, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the assistant, the one who'd started this entire chain. The text was short but sharp. "He's preparing a lawsuit. They're rewriting everything. There's one more file. It's buried deep, and I'm pulling it now before it disappears." The flash drive Zariah held in her hand was small, silent, and heavy with weight. It didn't visibly carry. No label, no encryption warning. Just files, endless documents, spreadsheets, and company PDFs that laid bare the machinery behind Charles Kingsley's empire. What began as a scandal over a Christmas gala had now opened into a tunnel of rot, and the deeper Zariah read, the more monstrous it all became. This wasn't generational wealth or innovation. Charles had engineered his rise through manipulation, weaving together public contracts, backroom handshakes, and donation deals disguised as philanthropy. And those weren't secrets anymore. They were receipts. Tanisha sat beside her, reading slowly, her lips pressed in a hard line. One document outlined a fake diversity report, complete with photoshopped images of diverse staff, copied signatures, and inflated hiring numbers, submitted during a government audit. Another revealed backdoor payments to local officials in exchange for zoning approvals and municipal contracts. Everything about Kingsley Corp was image first, integrity last. And yet, what truly rattled Zariah were the hiring policies. Deep inside a quarterly strategy report, was a section called Candidate Risk Index, where names with ethnic markers were flagged with quiet warnings. Another directive read, limit front-facing hires with strong dialects or non-neutral appearances during high-sensitivity season. It was all coded, but everyone knew what it meant. They weren't looking for qualifications. They were looking for whiteness, the kind that could pass through camera lenses and corporate boardrooms without raising questions. Zariah stared at the screen until her vision blurred. It wasn't just about the gala anymore. It never had been. He didn't just try to erase me, she whispered. He's been erasing people like me from the beginning. That night, they printed everything, line by line, with sticky notes and timelines. Evelyn Cross, a civil rights attorney and former mentee of Zariah's late father, arrived just after midnight with a legal pad and a fire in her eyes. She didn't flinch when she saw the documents. She simply said, "This is civil rights territory. You've got evidence of systemic discrimination tied to federal money. We're not just going to make noise. We're going to make history." By morning, the lawsuit was filed, Monroe v. Kingsley Corporation, and it landed like a brick through glass. It wasn't just Zariah's name on the paperwork. The suit included claims from former employees, contractors and vendors, some who had quietly endured exclusion, others who had tried to speak out but were forced into silence with NDA threats. Headlines screamed across news sites, "Civil rights lawsuit targets Kingsley Empire," and Gala scandal expands into federal complaint. Protesters outside Kingsley Corp doubled overnight, their chants now sharper, louder. It wasn't just about letting Zariah in, it was about tearing down the gate that had kept generations out. But the moment Zariah and her team began to exhale, reality struck again. The lawsuit had been assigned to Judge Malcolm Crane, a man with a well-documented history of siding with corporations in discrimination cases. Tanisha recognized the name instantly. That man hasn't ruled for a civil plaintiff in years, she said. He tossed the Jackson housing case, the one where the company blocked black renters with fake credit checks. Evelyn checked court records and grew quiet. Crane had once dismissed a lawsuit against a Kingsley subsidiary in under 3 days. The conflict wasn't just bias, it was personal history. Zariah stared at the screen, without blinking. "We just got assigned to a rigged referee," she said flatly. Tanisha placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "They want you to quit. They want you tired." But Zariah's voice didn't waver. "Then they're about to be disappointed." She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she got to work. They organized the evidence tighter. They called for public court access. If the system wanted to bury this case quietly, she'd make sure the whole country was watching. Evelyn prepared a motion to recuse the judge. Protesters began printing Crane's court history on flyers. Still, the courtroom remained silent, looming. And then, just as the last files were being scanned, Zariah's inbox dinged. No message, no greeting, just a subject line that made her blood turn cold. "The judge has secrets too." The name Malcolm Crane carried weight in Atlanta's legal corridors, but not the kind that inspired confidence. His reputation was carved in whispers, a judge known for cold decorum and velvet-gloved rulings that always seemed to tilt in favor of the powerful. But when Zariah saw his name appear on her case file, it wasn't fear that tightened in her stomach. It was fury. She remembered the Jackson housing case, how families were displaced over falsified paperwork, how the court dismissed their testimony in under 15 minutes. That had been Crane. The man wore bias in the folds of his robe, wrapped it in legality, and called it judicial efficiency. Tanisha knew the name too. She'd seen him at benefit galas, with Charles, laughing at private tables, shaking hands with the city's elite. "They play golf together," she said, "and he's ruled on Kingsley's cases before." That night she began making calls. Old contacts, ex-clients, paralegals, even clerks who had long since left the legal system. Every one of them had a story. Bias, dismissal, pattern. A black veteran denied disability benefits. A Latina teacher ignored in a wrongful termination case. Each story wasn't just a wound, it was a record. Zariah watched as Tanisha built the list. It wasn't strategy, it was survival. If they were going to stand before a man whose hands were already stained, they needed to expose how deep the red ran. Outside the courthouse, protesters had already mobilized. News of Crane's assignment lit a fire in the community. Placards filled the plaza. "You can't judge when you're complicit," and "Recuse yourself, Crane." They weren't just demanding justice. They were demanding a fair chance to be heard. Zariah didn't attend the protest. Not yet. She stayed home, surrounded by evidence, watching the narrative tighten. She didn't want to be emotional in front of cameras. She wanted to be undeniable. Ellen Cross filed a formal motion to recuse the judge, citing prior connections between Crane and Kingsley, as well as multiple rulings that showed a discernible pattern of prejudicial deference toward corporate interests over civil claims. The motion included screenshots of event photos, Crane and Charles, shoulder to shoulder, grinning beneath gala lights. It was strong but not a guarantee. Judges protected each other. Even Evelyn admitted, "It's a long shot, but it's enough to put heat under him." The heat started to rise. Media outlets began asking questions. An investigative piece aired on public radio, highlighting Crane's record, quoting lawyers who called him the gavel that always falls right. A former intern from Crane's office anonymously shared notes revealing how certain cases were quietly flagged, based on which attorneys were involved. Zariah's name had been circled in red ink, with a simple note beside it. Media bait. Proceed carefully. It wasn't law, it was theater. But the most damning piece hadn't arrived yet. It came in silence. On Christmas Eve, while the world outside blinked with soft lights and sugar-dusted storefronts, Zariah was sitting at the kitchen table, cross-referencing Crane's court history. Tanisha was on the couch, her laptop open, half watching a local holiday concert on TV, half scanning through old news archives. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon, not because they'd baked anything, but because Zariah lit a candle just to pretend something in this month still felt normal. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't loud. Just a single chime. Zariah looked at the clock. 8:41 p.m. Too late for deliveries. Too early for carolers. She walked to the door cautiously. No one stood outside. Just the quiet street, and a light drizzle turning to slush. But at her feet sat a rectangular cardboard box. No postage, no label. Just a black strip of tape across the top. She brought it inside, setting it on the dining table, while Tanisha stood up, wary. "Wait," she said. "Don't open it yet." But Zariah was already peeling the tape back. Inside wasn't a threat, it was a file folder. A thick, heavy one, with a sticky note on top, written in block letters, Crane, sealed settlements. Zariah's breath caught. She pulled the first sheet free. The contents were explosive. Settlement agreements. Quiet, confidential, buried under non-disclosure clauses, involving at least 3 cases where Judge Malcolm Crane had suggested resolution terms that benefited corporate defendants, all of whom had direct connections to Charles Kingsley's donor network. One case involved a black woman suing a Kingsley-funded construction company over workplace burdensome. Another was a class action employment suit against a PR firm tied to Kingsley's board. In each case, Crane had been instrumental in fast-tracking private settlements that included gag orders and sealed records, and now someone had unsealed them. Attached were signed affidavits, handwritten letters, even a scanned image of a check written from a Kingsley-associated fund, dated 3 days after a sealed dismissal Crane had presided over. Zariah felt her hands go cold. Tanisha picked up the note again. There was no name, no sender, just one more sentence scribbled beneath the file label. He doesn't just owe Kingsley favors, he owes him protection. They sat in silence for nearly a full minute, the weight of the discovery filling every corner of the room. It was bigger than bias now. It was conspiracy. The judge wasn't just familiar with Charles, he was compromised by him. Zariah exhaled slowly, then stood. "We're not just fighting a rigged game," she said. "We're fighting the people who built the table." Tanisha's eyes narrowed. "Then it's time to flip the table." And just as they began scanning the documents, Zariah's phone buzzed again. It was a text from the same encrypted number that had delivered the previous evidence. "There's one more file. Not about the judge. About you. He's holding something back, and you're not going to like it." Christmas morning arrived without warmth. No carols floated through Zariah's house. No lazy joy softened the edges of the day. The sky outside was pale and undecided, like it couldn't quite commit to being bright. Zariah sat at the dining table before sunrise, staring at the documents spread before her as if they might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. The anonymous package had cracked something open that could never be sealed again. What lay in front of her was no longer circumstantial or speculative. It was structural rot, detailed, time-stamped, and meticulously hidden. The files revealed that Judge Malcolm Crane wasn't just ethically compromised, he was actively corrupt. Offshore bank statements traced through shell companies showed deposits that aligned precisely with rulings he had issued in favor of corporate defendants. One account in the Cayman Islands received a six-figure transfer 3 days after he dismissed a discrimination lawsuit involving a Kingsley-funded subsidiary. Another document detailed luxury holiday gifts, private resort stays, golf retreats, and silent charitable donations made in his wife's name, all quietly funded by corporations whose cases passed through his courtroom. But the most chilling evidence wasn't financial. It was intellectual theft, draft rulings written not by Crane but by defense attorneys, uploaded, edited, and signed as judicial opinions without alteration. Justice hadn't just been biased, it had been outsourced. Soraya felt sick as she read through it all. But she didn't look away. Tanisha stood behind her, one hand resting on the back of her chair, steady and protective. "Your father warned us," Tanisha said quietly. "He knew the system wasn't broken. He knew it was working." By 7:30 a.m., Evelyn Cross was on a secure video call, her face grave but resolute. She had already looped in a federal ethics watchdog and a trusted investigative journalist. There would be no quiet filing this time. No sealed motions. This would go public, immediately and loudly. "If we wait," Evelyn warned, "they'll bury this under holiday coverage. We go now, or not at all." Soraya nodded. "Then we go now." By mid-morning, the documents were live. Screenshots of offshore accounts circulated alongside copies of ghost-written rulings. Headlines broke through holiday programming like sirens. Judge accused of corruption in civil rights case. And ethics scandal rocks Atlanta judiciary. Protesters returned to the courthouse, louder than before, holding signs not just demanding recusal, but accountability. The pressure mounted hour by hour. Unstoppable now. Judge Malcolm Crane released a statement just after noon. It was brief, clinical, and carefully worded. He denied wrongdoing but announced his immediate recusal, in the interest of preserving public trust. No apology, no explanation, just retreat. Within hours, the case was reassigned to a new judge, one without known ties to Kingsley or his network. It should have felt like a victory. But Charles Kingsley wasn't finished. By late afternoon, the counterattack began. An anonymous blog post appeared, then another, then a dozen more, all pushing the same narrative with eerie coordination. Soraya was painted not as a whistleblower, but as a troubled teenager with a history of emotional instability. Old-school disciplinary notes were leaked out of context. A single counseling referral from years earlier was twisted into a diagnosis. Her activism was reframed as manipulation. Headlines shifted tone subtly but deliberately. Teen at center of Gala scandal faces scrutiny and questions raised about Monroe family motives. Soraya watched it unfold in real time, her phone lighting up with notifications that no longer felt supportive, just invasive. "They're trying to break you," Tanisha said, her voice tight with anger. "They couldn't silence you, so now they're trying to discredit you." By evening, Charles's PR firm issued a statement condemning the weaponization of incomplete information and suggesting that Soraya was being used by radical legal activists to further an agenda. It was polished, rehearsed, and deeply personal. He didn't deny the documents outright. He didn't have to. All he needed was doubt. Just enough to muddy the waters. And then came the final blow of the day. Soraya was sitting on the edge of her bed when Tanisha's phone rang. She answered it with a casual greeting that vanished mid-sentence. Her face drained of color. "What do you mean, expelled?" she asked sharply. "On what grounds?" Soraya stood up slowly. The call ended, and Tanisha turned to her, disbelief written across her face. "Your school says they received an anonymous tip," she said. "They're claiming behavioral concerns and disruption of the learning environment. They say, effective immediately, you're no longer enrolled." Soraya felt the floor tilt beneath her. "That's not possible," she said. "I haven't even been there since." "They said the decision was unanimous," Tanisha continued, her voice shaking now. "They won't say who sent the tip." Soraya sank back onto the bed, heart pounding. She understood instantly. This wasn't about school. It was retaliation. A warning shot. They couldn't control the courtroom anymore, so they went after the place she still tried to live a normal life. Her phone buzzed again. One message. "Unknown number. Told you he'd go for what matters." Soraya stared at the screen, her chest tight but her eyes dry. The smear campaign had escalated into something far more personal. They weren't just attacking her credibility now. They were trying to isolate her, strip her of community, routine, and future. Tanisha knelt in front of her. "This doesn't define you," she said firmly. "They don't get to decide who you are." Soraya looked up, something hard and unmovable, settling behind her eyes. "No," she said quietly. But they just showed me how afraid they really are. And somewhere behind closed doors, Charles Kingsley was smiling, certain he had finally found the pressure point that would make her disappear. He was wrong. The letter wasn't sent through email. It arrived by courier, urgent, deliberate, and unnerving. Tanisha opened it at the kitchen counter, her brow furrowing with each line. Across the room, Zariah sat in her sweatshirt, hunched over her phone, half expecting another wave of backlash. She didn't notice Tanisha freeze until she heard the paper snap. "They've expelled you," Tanisha said, her voice low and controlled, but trembling at the edges. Effective immediately. No warning. No meeting. Just that. Zariah stood slowly. "What?" she asked, the word catching in her throat. Tanisha handed her the letter. It was dressed in formal language: disruptive presence, learning environment, parental concerns, but none of it held specifics. There were no dates, no incidents, no violations, just the vague, legalistic justification of an institution desperate to cover a decision already made behind closed doors. Zariah read the letter again. Then again. "I've never even had a detention," she whispered. "Never. Not one." Tanisha looked at her with eyes full of fire. "This isn't about what you did, it's about who you're becoming." The news spread quickly. By the next morning, social media was ablaze with fury. Civil rights activists, education reformers, and everyday parents called out Hamilton Prep's retaliation. Hashtags surged: "None let Zariah learn," "Hamilton exposed," "expelled for speaking." Evelyn Cross issued a public statement, calling the decision a deliberate abuse of institutional power targeting a black student for challenging white comfort. But something deeper was stirring. Something systemic. It started with one message, then another. Black students, current and former, began reaching out to Zariah, anonymously. One girl said she was removed from student council after reporting racial slurs in a locker room. Another had been quietly transferred after questioning a history teacher's comments about slavery. Zariah read each message with growing clarity. This wasn't just her story. It was part of a machine, one that quietly punished black students for being visible, vocal, or proud. Tanisha and Evelyn compiled the accounts into a growing spreadsheet. In less than a week, 17 stories emerged. Expulsions, suspensions, forced withdrawals, counselor redirections, all subtle, all off the record, all racial. The school had no trouble masking it behind academic language. But when seen together, the pattern was undeniable. Zariah, unintentionally, had lifted the veil, and now others were stepping forward from the shadows. Evelyn filed a civil rights complaint against the school district. The media followed. A watchdog organization released a report showing that although black students made up just 12% of Hamilton Prep, they represented over 70% of suspensions in the last 5 years. The numbers were no longer deniable. The silence had become deafening. Zariah stayed home. Her days no longer involved classes or teachers. Her world had shifted from school desks to news cycles. She didn't feel like a student anymore. She felt like evidence, like someone who had been placed on trial for telling the truth. She missed the normal things: walking past her locker, seeing her name on a class roster, hearing her name called during morning announcements. But more than that, she missed being seen for her mind instead of her resistance. And just when it felt like the storm couldn't swell further, it happened. A student, Davon, a quiet junior from her English class, reached out through an encrypted link. No preamble, just a note: "You need to see this." Attached was a video clip. The grainy footage had been recorded with a phone left running in the faculty lounge. Zariah clicked play. The video opened with laughter, the kind that comes easy when people think no one's watching. A group of teachers sat sipping coffee, casual and unfiltered. Putnam, Zariah's former English teacher, stood and mocked her in a fake sobbing voice. "They didn't let me in the gala because I'm so brave and inspiring." Laughter followed. Another teacher added, "She's acting like she got dragged off a bus in the 60s." A third leaned back and said, "Honestly, she's just mad the world isn't built for people like her." They all laughed again. Zariah didn't blink. She didn't cry. She just watched. The people who had smiled at her during report card nights, who praised her for her articulate essays, were now mocking her pain, not privately in thought, but openly among peers, without shame. It was casual racism in its purest form, dressed in humor, cloaked in denial, and performed by people who claimed to care. Tanisha turned away halfway through the video, her fists clenched. These people, they're not teachers, they're gatekeepers. Evelyn was notified immediately. That same evening, The video hit the internet. It spread faster than the expulsion story had. The hashtags evolved. Knock by my teacher. Zariah was right. Let her in and let her learn. By the following day, protesters lined the school's gates. Parents demanded resignations. Reporters ambushed school board members at their homes. A district press conference was drowned out by chance. Even former Hamilton alumni stepped in, calling for a full investigation into faculty conduct. The school couldn't bury this. Not anymore. Zariah didn't attend the protest. She didn't need to. Her voice was already echoing louder than any chant. But just as she sat down at her desk that evening, her inbox full of support, her story making headlines again, a new message appeared. No sender, no greeting. Just a single line. Zariah sat stiff-backed at her desk, eyes locked on the screen, as the second video clip began to play. Unlike the first, which captured mocking faculty laughter in the lounge, this one was more chilling in its formality. It was recorded during a staff development meeting at Hamilton Prep, a grainy cell phone angle from behind a stack of books, time-stamped just 3 weeks earlier. At first glance, it looked innocuous. A group of teachers, a projector screen, a speaker at the front. But as the sound filled the room, the language made her blood run cold. We're seeing more of what I'd call urban energy in upperclassmen, said the assistant principal leading the session. Students displaying uncoachable confidence, challenging authority figures in ways that don't align with our community values. Zariah paused the video. Uncoachable confidence? She whispered, then glanced back at Tanisha. That's me, right? That's what they meant. Tanisha folded her arms, eyes hard. It's what they've always meant. The video resumed. The room of educators nodded, murmured in agreement. The speaker continued. It's important we get ahead of this trend before it grows, particularly among legacy-challenged students. Activist personas can embolden others. We need to isolate before they influence. Legacy-challenged, activist personas. Isolate before influence. Each phrase was clinical, composed, and vicious. This wasn't accidental bias or isolated ignorance. This was policy wrapped in pedagogy, control disguised as concern. The teachers in that room weren't shocked. They weren't resisting. They were participating. And then, the damning line. A veteran teacher at the back of the room chuckled and said, "Can't have too many uppity types walking around like they own the place. Makes the donors nervous." No one pushed back. One person even laughed. Then the meeting moved on, as if nothing had been said at all. Zariah sat motionless, jaw clenched, fingers digging into the edge of her desk. It wasn't just the expulsion that had been planned. It was her silencing. Her identity, her voice, her presence in those hallways had never been welcome. They'd tolerated her excellence as long as it stayed quiet. The moment it spoke, it became a threat. That footage, combined with the earlier faculty lounge video, tore through the community. Parents who had once defended the school were now demanding answers. Alumni published open letters denouncing Hamilton Prep's culture. A group of major donors pulled their funding. The school board scrambled to contain the fallout. Emergency meetings were held. Spokespeople issued apologies filled with hollow phrases like ongoing investigations and unfortunate misunderstandings. But the rot went deeper. While Evelyn and her team pressed the district for accountability, a new thread of evidence began to surface. Leaked emails revealed that Hamilton's legal defense wasn't being paid by the district or the board, but by a third-party foundation linked directly to Charles Kingsley. Kingsley wasn't officially listed on any board documents. He hadn't donated publicly, but behind closed doors, he had financed Hamilton's legal team, coordinated crisis communication strategies, and advised board members on narrative control. In one email from the school's crisis consultant, a line stood out like a flare in the dark. Mr. K remains fully committed to maintaining Hamilton's values and shielding its long-term integrity. Zariah read the line twice, then a third time. So it wasn't just about the gala. Kingsley had a hand in every retaliatory step that followed. The media spin, the expulsion, the silence campaign. He didn't just want her excluded, he wanted her erased. Then came the twist no one expected. A former Kingsley employee, Lynn Merriman, a woman who had spent over a decade managing his events, contacted Evelyn. She'd seen the interviews, the protests, the outcry. She said she was done staying quiet. Evelyn arranged a secure video call. Zariah and Tanisha joined. Lynn appeared on screen wearing a faded hoodie, eyes shadowed with fatigue. "I planned those Christmas galas," she said. "Every year, I was the one who organized the invites, checked the guest lists, Booked the tables, and I remember yours. Zariah. Your name was added by Charles's assistant. You were supposed to be honored that night. You weren't just invited, you were featured. Zariah leaned forward. Then why was I turned away? Lynn reached off camera and lifted a piece of paper. A printed spreadsheet. Because of this, she said. It was never meant to be seen. It's called the High Risk Attendee Review. She read the header aloud. Internal screening. Do not publicize. Zariah's name was on the list. Beside it, father's history, civil rights litigation, media risk, and in red text, revoke RSVP. If challenged, cite safety concerns. Tanisha went still. Lynn added, Charles called it his snowstorm file. Said it was to make sure no one brought unwanted attention to his events. Snowstorm was his code for too much color in the room. She pulled out another document. Longer, denser. This is the full list. She said 53 names. All black. Some Latinx. Every single one marked for exclusion with code phrases. Activist adjacent. Media magnet. Difficult background. Most never even knew they were blacklisted. Zariah stared at the document. Her name was only one among many. This wasn't about her anymore. It never had been. It was about a system that used wealth to sculpt its own reality, where power could decide who was allowed to be visible, and who would be turned away at the door. How many other schools has he funded? Zariah asked quietly. Lynn hesitated. More than I want to admit, but I can show you. The document didn't look dramatic at first glance. No bold warnings, no classified stamps, just a spreadsheet, rows, columns, muted formatting. But the moment Zariah's eyes landed on the header, her stomach tightened. Internal guest risk assessment. Beneath it, another line in smaller font. Not for external distribution. Lynn had warned them, but nothing prepared Zariah for what she was seeing. Names stretched down the page, dozens of them, each paired with short, chilling annotations. Image risk, activist adjacency, media volatility, uncontrolled narrative. These weren't security concerns. They were fear labels. Fear of voices that couldn't be bought. Fear of people who didn't stay silent. Zariah's name sat at the very top, not alphabetically, strategically. Next to it was a note that made her chest tighten. High-profile legacy, litigation history, potential disruption. Her entire existence had been reduced to a threat assessment, not because of what she had done, but because of who she was connected to, what she represented, and what she refused to shrink into. Tanisha leaned over her shoulder, reading silently, her jaw clenched so tight, it trembled. This isn't a guest list, she said finally. This is a hit list. This isn't a guest list, she said finally. This is a hit list. They didn't release the document immediately. Evelyn insisted on verification, metadata timestamps, cross-checking names. But within 24 hours, the truth was undeniable. The list was real. Worse, it was operational. Several names belonged to black and brown professionals, who confirmed they'd been mysteriously uninvited from Kingsley events over the years. Often at the last minute, often with vague excuses about capacity changes or security protocols. A few had even been told they were never invited at all, despite having email confirmations saved. When the blacklist went public, it detonated. Major outlets picked it up within minutes. Headlines blared. Leaked blacklist reveals Kingsley's pattern of racial exclusion, and documents show systematic blocking of black professionals from elite events. The story was no longer about one gala. It was about a decade of quiet gatekeeping, a curated illusion of diversity that allowed Charles Kingsley to parade philanthropy while privately controlling who was allowed proximity to power. Names on the list began speaking out. A black architect explained how he'd been invited to speak at a Kingsley-funded panel, only to be disinvited days before the event, with no explanation. A Latina nonprofit director revealed she'd been told her presence would confuse the donors. A young black tech founder admitted she'd blamed herself for years, believing she wasn't polished enough, not knowing she'd been flagged long before she ever stepped into the room. The narrative cracked wide open. Charles Kingsley's allies felt it first. Sponsors began distancing themselves, issuing statements that used words like deeply concerning and inconsistent with our values. Board members resigned quietly. One longtime partner leaked a memo stating, "We were not aware of any exclusionary screening practices and are reviewing all prior collaborations." Translation: they were running. Charles himself remained silent, until he wasn't. A carefully staged video statement appeared on his foundation's website. He stood in front of a bookshelf, lighting warm, tone measured. He called the list a mischaracterized internal planning document, claimed it had been taken out of context, and accused radical activists of weaponizing private materials. He never denied its existence. He never apologized to those listed. He simply reframed the harm as misunderstanding. It didn't work. The public had receipts now, and names. This wasn't abstract racism. It was organized, deliberate, documented. Even conservative commentators struggled to defend it without sounding absurd. The illusion that Charles Kingsley was a misunderstood philanthropist collapsed under the weight of his own paperwork. Zariah watched the coverage from her room, laptop balanced on her knees, her name echoing across channels she never imagined would speak it. She felt exposed, but not alone. For the first time, she wasn't the only one telling the story. The people who'd been quietly erased were stepping forward, filling in the gaps, confirming patterns. What Charles had tried to keep invisible was now undeniable. Tanisha sat beside her, squeezing her hand. "They can't put this back in the dark," she said. "Not now." Zariah nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. This moment, this exposure, was powerful, but